Waked, we're here to talk about strength-based assessment and about what that label actually commits us to. Assessment carries weight. It follows a learner into meetings, files, referrals, designations, funding decisions, and intervention plans, and often into how adults describe that learner for years afterward. A single sentence in a report can become the story that travels ahead of a child. The question for today is what kind of story we want assessment to tell. The frame for this session holds three commitments together: represent learners accurately, support them fairly, and protect their dignity while opening access to what they need. These depend on each other. Protecting dignity without naming supports needs can close off access. Pursuing access through deficit-heavy language can damage how a learner is seen and how they come to see themselves. Strength-based assessment asks for honesty and care applied together, not traded off against each other. The toolkit grounding this session treats context as clinical and educational evidence, strengths as foundational evidence, and standardized tools as instruments that require transparency about their limits. That's the backbone of everything we'll practice today. To begin, we'll surface how assessment actually feels in your school before we try to change it. By the end of this module, you should be able to do three things: notice the frame, rebuild the evidence, and change the report. Noticing the frame means catching the moment assessment language quietly turns context into deficit. Rebuilding the evidence means treating strengths, relationships, culture, land, family knowledge, and learner voice as data with the same standing as a test score. Changing the report means writing language precise enough to support dignity, access, and action at once. Facts always arrive inside a frame, and the frame determines what they mean. A deficit-first frame interprets everything through what's missing. A frame built on strength and context can read the same evidence toward a more accurate account of what a learner actually needs to succeed. Before we go further, I want the room's honest starting point. In one word, what does assessment usually feel like in your school? I mean, what it actually feels like, not the version we're supposed to say. This slide sits at the center of the session. Assessment shapes how a learner is understood, what supports become available, how a family experiences the school system, and which trajectories open or close. A standardized score looks neutral on the page: numbers, percentiles, ranges, technical language. Once it enters the school system, it starts doing things, opening a door to support, closing one because a learner falls short of a cutoff, shaping whether a teacher sees a child as capable, delayed, resistant, bright, disengaged, or misunderstood. Accuracy here has two layers. Technical precision asks whether the tool was administered correctly. Contextual accuracy asks whether the result was interpreted correctly inside the learner's actual life. Language, relationships, culture, opportunity, environment, both matter, and as a result, can be technically precise and still misleading without the second layer. For Indigenous learners, specifically, this gap is structural rather than incidental. Many standardized tools are normed on non-Indigenous populations and built on assumptions that don't account for relational learning, land-based learning, cultural identity, language exposure, or the ongoing effects of colonial policy on access and opportunity. A technically sound administration can still produce a result that misinterprets the learner it was meant to describe. Deficit first assessment asks a narrow set of questions. What's wrong? How far below norm? What label explains the behavior? What compliance plan follows? These questions are familiar because most systems are built around them and they move very quickly. But speed comes at the cost of range. Strength-based assessment asks a different set. Where is capacity already visible? What conditions support success? What does context explain? What support opens access? Here's the actual mechanism, stated plainly. Naming a learner's strengths and context changes how a genuine support need gets defined by the conditions surrounding it rather than by the learner's character, without erasing the need itself from the record. This distinction matters because a deficit-first frame routinely confuses performance with capacity. A learner may perform poorly in a noisy room with an unfamiliar adult on a culturally unfamiliar task, under time pressure, in a language-heavy format. That performance is the real information about the interaction between the learner and those specific conditions. On its own, it isn't evidence about underlying capacity. So when this session asks for more accurate language, here's what that means in practice. Precision about what was observed, where, under what conditions, and what changed the outcome. That precision is what makes the resulting support plan usable. These four standards are the spine of the toolkit. Strength precedes interpretation. A narrative establishes observable capacity before it names a support need. This is a sequencing requirement, not a courtesy. Without a baseline of where capacity already shows up, there's no reference point for designing support that actually fits the learner. Context constitutes data. Family, nation, language, land, relationship, and lived experience are evidence, not background color mentioned once and set aside during interpretation. They determine what a finding means. Relational accountability matters. A report's impact outlives its technical accuracy. The same correctly administered process can build a family's trust in the school or damage it, depending on how the findings are framed. This standard holds the writer responsible for that effect, not only for procedural correctness. Cultural safety supersedes convenience. When a standardized method risks misinterpreting a learner, the obligation is to adapt, qualify, or limit how the finding gets used. Even when the standard procedure would be faster, finishing the process is not the goal. Representing the learner accurately is. If standardized scores and classroom observed difficulty aren't the only data, here's what else counts. Relational indicators, belonging, kinship, reciprocity, trust. In a classroom, this shows up as who a learner seeks out, where they feel safe, and who they can learn alongside. And when humor, confidence, care, or leadership appear. These are conditions under which capacity becomes visible. Cultural indicators, language, identity, values, teachings, practice. Cultural connection supports identity, emotional regulation, belonging, and resilience for Indigenous learners specifically. Where that connection is missing, the absence more often reflects a barrier to access than a lack of interest or capacity. Land-based indicators, place, observation, harvesting, outdoor regulation, learning through doing. Some learners show their clearest focus, memory leadership, and problem solving outside a classroom. Assessing only at a desk can miss their strongest evidence entirely. Holistic indicators, mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual balance, sleep, grief, hunger, safety, racism, identity, family stress, sensory load, and a sense of purpose all bear on learning. A complete assessment accounts for them rather than treating behavior as separable from the rest of a person's circumstances. A standardized score has a real specific scope. It tells us how a learner performed on a given task, in a given setting, under given conditions, and with a given language demand. That's genuine information, bounded by what the instrument can actually measure. It cannot tell us whether the learner performs differently with a trusted adult, whether the task was culturally familiar, whether the learner was dysregulated, anxious, tired, hungry, grieving, or simply unsure why the task mattered. It cannot tell us what a family sees at home, what community sees relationally, or what the learner shows on the land. Those gaps are not failures of the instrument, they're outside its design. A complete interpretation closes those gaps with observed strength, family and learner voice, cultural and language context, and the conditions under which engagement improves. Score plus context produces information that can be acted on responsibly. Score without context tends to harden into an authority it was never built to carry. The line to remember: standardized data informs the account of a learner. Does not become the account. This is where work gets concrete, rewriting deficit-heavy phrases into language that's precise, contextual, and usable by whoever reads it next. Take non-compliant. It reads as objective because it's used constantly, but it already contains a conclusion. That refusal is the primary issue. A more grounded version demonstrates autonomy and selective engagement. Responsiveness is influenced by relational context and task relevance. The concern is still on the page. What changes is that the sentence now points towards something to examine and a way to support it. Take poor attention, for example. Poor relative to what? In what setting? During what task? With whom? For how long? Try instead. Attention varies across environments. Focus increases in meaningful, relational, or hands-on contexts. This version is actionable. It points directly at task design, relationship, and engagement conditions. Try limited vocabulary. It becomes emerging vocabulary development, communicates meaningfully within unfamiliar and culturally relevant contexts. The language need is still named. What's corrected is a leap from limited performance in one setting to limited capacity overall. Withdrawn becomes demonstrates selective engagement. Participation is influenced by relational safety, familiarity, and comfort. Quietness, observation, or a slower relational pace is easy to misread as social deficit when it may be a culturally informed or safety-based way of engaging. Here is our case sentence. The student is non-compliant, easily distracted, and avoids work during group tasks. It reads as ordinary. Many of us have written something close to it. Let's slow it down. What was actually observed? Perhaps a student didn't start the task, looked around the room, left the group, or didn't respond to a direction. Those are observations. Non-compliant, distracted, and avoids work are interpretations layered on top. Possibly accurate, possibly incomplete. Here's the more useful question. What assumptions does the sentence carry? Does it assume the learner understands the task? That the group felt safe? That the work was meaningful? the learner had the language regulation, sensory capacity, or relational trust the task required. Does it read as refusal, where the more accurate word might be overwhelm? Use Mentimeter to name the assumptions you see. One word or a short phrase is enough. School systems tend to reward certainty. A report sounds more professional when it sounds confident, but confidence built on thin evidence is risk wearing a confident voice. When evidence is incomplete, name the limitation directly. What's unknown and why? Was the learner observed in only one setting? Was the task unfamiliar? Was the language demand high? Was family input missing? Then identify what might be contributing. Tool limits, cultural mismatch, language exposure, relational context, sensory load, emotional state, to interpret the concern accurately, not to excuse it away. From there, hold conclusions provisionally. Partial evidence gathered under narrow conditions shouldn't harden into a global label. Low functioning, nonverbal, oppositional, unable. Seek the context that's still missing. Family voice, classroom observation across settings, community information, land-based or naturalistic observation where it fits. Frame next steps as provisional, responsive to what that additional context reveals. The standard worth holding on to. Clinical and educational strength lies in qualifying and contextualizing a finding, not in projecting more certainty than the evidence supports. How a concern gets communicated shapes whether a family feels respected or judged, whether they stay engaged with the school or pull back, and whether the resulting support feels collaborative or imposed. Begin with strengths that are specific and observed. For example, your child builds trust quickly with familiar adults, uses humor easily with peers, remembers land-based experiences in detail, and shows real persistence on hands-on tasks. That carries different weight than "they're a nice kid, but." Describe observations rather than judgments. Instead of "they are defiant," try "when the task shifted to independent writing, they put their head down and didn't begin for 7 minutes." That gives the family something concrete to discuss alongside you. Situate what you observed in context. Environment, language exposure, relationships, task design, sensory load, experience, without losing the concern itself. This locates it accurately rather than softening it. Then invite the family's interpretation directly. They know this learner across time, place, relationship, and history in ways the school doesn't. That knowledge is evidence, not anecdote. Plan the support together from there, so the family leaves with understanding and a next step rather than judgment. Here's the sample script. We want to start with what we're seeing as strengths. Your child shows strong relational awareness and responds well when they feel connected to the adult leading the activity. We've also noticed that written tasks are harder to begin when instructions are only given verbally or when the room is busy. We're wondering how this shows up at home or in other settings. Your read on this will help us understand whether it's about the task, the environment, confidence, language, or something else. From there, we'd like to plan support that builds on what's already working. Use this as a final check before a report or set of notes goes out. What's required? A strength-based narrative. Findings situated in relational context. Clearly stated limitations of any standardized tools used. Family voice. Recommendations that allow for flexibility. and uncertainty documented where it exists. Watch out for deficit-only narratives, a standardized score functioning as a sole determinant, culturally normative behavior described as pathology, environment and relationship left out entirely, fixed conclusions stated without qualification, and family or community perspective excluded. This checklist applies just as well to independent education plans, team notes, referral forms, emails, and meeting language. A learner can be reduced in a two-line note as easily as in a full report. The governing principle: a strong assessment is defined by representation, context, and impact, not by how many tools were used to produce it. More tools don't automatically mean better understanding. Better interpretation does. From here, the question is implementation, making this real over the next 30, 60, and 90 days. First 30 days, the audit language. Collect 3 to 5 anonymized excerpts, report language, IEP comments, referral notes, meeting phrases, and flag where the wording is deficit heavy or thin on context. The goal is finding patterns, not finding people. In the next 60 days, build shared language. A school-based sentence bank for strengths, context, uncertainty, and support gives people a better default to reach for under pressure, when there's no time to compose careful language from scratch. Next 90 days. Change the meeting routine. Require strengths, family voice, context before any discussion of concerns or placement begins. One sequencing change: strengths first, context next, concerns after. Support aligned to all three. Can shift the tone of an entire team meeting. Where does this learner show capacity? What conditions support success? And what does the family know that the school doesn't? What context has to be considered before the concern gets interpreted? None of this requires a district-wide policy to start. It can begin with one team changing the order of one conversation. Before closing, each person will name one practice they're willing to reconsider. We'll close with one concrete commitment. The prompt: what is one assessment practice you will reconsider, rewrite, or redesign after today? It can be small. One phrase you retire. One question you start asking. One meeting routine you adjust. One earlier point at which you bring in family knowledge. The commitment needs to be concrete because strength-based assessment is a practice. It shows up in order of a conversation, the words on a page, the evidence included, the humility brought to uncertainty, the way dignity and access gets protected together. Strength-based assessment refuses incomplete evidence. A hard truth stripped of context can do harm. A concern documented without strengths can calcify into identity. A score left uninterpreted can become a cage. The responsibility in front of us is straightforward. Make the story fuller, more accurate, and more useful to the learner it describes. This framework draws on Indigenous methodologies, relational accountability, the 4 R's: respect, relevance, reciprocity, responsibility, Indigenous wellness measurement, and rights-based frameworks, including UNDRIP. Strength-based assessment is a matter of validity, ethics, cultural safety, and educational equity, not a style preference. It asks for language accurate enough to secure support and careful enough to protect dignity at the same time. Thank you for the work you already do with learners and families. Before the next report, meeting, or learner profile crosses your desk, ask one question. What becomes more accurate here if we start with strengths and treat context as evidence?